The obsidian table stretched across the chamber of the Galaxy Council, its polished surface reflecting the cold light from above. Captain Matthew Rains stood firm, his shoulders squared beneath the weight of his Terran military uniform. As Earth's military representative and head of the Terran delegation, he kept his expression impassive as he scanned the faces of the council members seated around him. 10 years had passed since the Trivar crisis, when humanity had saved many core worlds from destruction. Yet the gratitude of the Galaxy Council had been short-lived. Now, in the towering spire of Veros Prime, where the most powerful species gathered, Matthew could feel nothing but contempt emanating from the alien delegates. The Virari representative, Councillor Drellis, sat directly across from him, her silver skin gleaming under the chamber lights. To her left and right sat delegates from the Junoan, Oryx, Tarkin, and Orex civilizations, all regarding the human with barely concealed disdain. "Captain Rains," Councillor Drellis finally spoke, her voice melodic yet edged with authority. "The Galaxy Council has convened today to finalize the Military Limitation Treaty. Earth has enjoyed unprecedented expansion and technological advancement in recent years. For the stability of the galactic community, certain restrictions are necessary." Matthew's jaw tightened. For 6 hours, they had discussed the so-called peace terms. Each clause was more restrictive than the last. Limitations on fleet size, weapons development, colonization rights. The subtext was clear. Earth was to be contained, controlled, relegated to second-class status in perpetuity. "Councillor Drellis," Matthew replied, his voice steady but cold. "I have listened patiently to the Council's demands. You speak of eternal peace while attempting to chain humanity's right to self-defense and determination. Let me be absolutely clear. Earth will not comply." A ripple of murmurs circulated around the table. Syndic Vera of the Junoan delegation hissed through narrow teeth. "You dare reject the Council's generous offer?" Matthew stood, pushing his chair back with deliberate force. "This isn't an offer. It's an ultimatum dressed as diplomacy. The Terran delegation is withdrawing from these negotiations, effective immediately." Warlord Korak of the Oryx slammed a scaled fist onto the table. "You cannot simply walk away from the Council's authority." "Watch me," Matthew replied, nodding to Ambassador Hall, the only other human in the room. "Earth will not submit to becoming your vassal state. We saved half your worlds during the Trivar crisis. And this is how you repay us? By trying to collar us?" Councillor Drellis rose slowly, her silver eyes narrowing. "Captain Rains, reconsider your position. The consequences of defying the Council are preferable to surrender," Matthew finished. "Ambassador Hall, we're leaving." As the Terran delegation strode toward the chamber doors, Teknar, the Tarkin representative, called after them. "The Council's patience has limits. Captain, don't mistake our diplomatic approach for weakness." Matthew didn't bother turning around. "So does Earth's, Teknar. So does Earth's." The journey from the Council chamber to the docking bay was tense but uneventful. Commander Briggs, Matthew's second-in-command, was waiting for them at the shuttle. One look at Matthew's face told him everything he needed to know. "Preparations complete, sir?" Briggs asked, falling into step beside his captain. "No compromise was reached," Matthew replied tersely. "Alert the fleet. We're breaking orbit immediately." Within 30 minutes, the ISS Revenant and 12 Terran vessels had powered up their engines, preparing to leave Veros Prime's orbit. Matthew stood on the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, as he stared at the view screen showing the gleaming spires of the planet below. "Captain," Lieutenant Vaughn called from her station. 3 Council ships are moving to intercept our departure vector. They're hailing us." "On screen," Matthew ordered. The view screen shifted to show a Virari commander, flanked by Oryx and Junoan officers. "Captain Rains, by order of the Galaxy Council, your fleet is to stand down and return to dock. This is not a request." Matthew's eyes hardened. This is an illegal blockade of diplomatic vessels. Stand aside or we will consider this an act of war. You have 10 seconds to comply, the Varari commander responded. Matthew turned to Briggs. Battle stations. Shields up. Arm weapons but hold fire. The bridge erupted into controlled chaos as the crew rushed to their positions. The Revenant's engines hummed with increased power, and the tactical display showed the other Terran ships falling into defensive formation. 5 seconds. Captain Rains, the Varari commander warned. Matthew took a deep breath. Lieutenant Vaughn, plot an escape vector through their blockade. Minimal damage if possible. But we're getting through. Commander Briggs, give the order to the fleet. All ships acknowledging, sir, Briggs confirmed. 3, 2, the Varari commander counted. Now, Matthew ordered. The Terran fleet surged forward. The Council ships opened fire first, energy beams lancing through space toward the Revenant. The shields flared, but held as the human vessels returned fire with precision targeting. Target their weapon systems only, Matthew commanded. I want us through that blockade, not starting a war. The space between Veros Prime and Freedom became a chaotic light show of weapons fire and evasive maneuvers. One of the Terran frigates took a direct hit, but maintained course. The Revenant's superior targeting systems disabled the main weapons array of the Varari vessel, creating a gap in their defensive line. Gap detected, sir, Vaughn called out. Vector clear. All ships, punch through, Matthew ordered. The Terran fleet accelerated through the opening, engines blazing at maximum thrust. Several more shots were exchanged, but within minutes, they had broken through the blockade and were approaching the jump point to hyperspace. Damage report, Matthew demanded. Minor hull breaches on decks 4 and 7, being contained, Briggs reported. The Horizon has moderate damage but reports all systems functional. No casualties. Matthew nodded grimly. Once we're clear, I want a secure channel to Earth. President Langley needs to know that diplomacy has failed. As the stars streaked into lines and the Terran fleet escaped into hyperspace, news of the confrontation spread across the galaxy with shocking speed. Terran fleet breaks Council blockade became the headline on every major information network. The Council hastily issued a statement calling the incident a regrettable misunderstanding. But public opinion was already shifting. Many worlds that had chafed under Council authority for centuries watched with keen interest as humanity openly defied the established order. Back on Earth, the response was swift and unified. President Langley ordered a full military mobilization of reserves. Earth's orbital defense platforms hummed to life, and colonial outposts across Terran space strengthened their defenses. The temperature gauge of galactic politics had shifted from cautious diplomacy to open hostility. They'll retaliate, Admiral Harrow warned during the emergency session of Earth's Defense Council. The question is where and when. Matthew, joining via secure transmission from the Revenant, nodded in agreement. The Council won't risk a direct assault on Earth. They'll target our outer colonies first, try to force us back to the negotiating table from a position of strength. Sigma Erodani, Defense Minister Calder suggested, pointing to the holographic map. It's our most isolated colony, strategically valuable but not heavily defended. I concur, Matthew said. The Revenant can lead a defensive fleet there immediately. If we can predict their first move, we can turn it against them. President Langley's expression was grave. Authorized, Captain. But understand what's at stake here. If we defeat a Council assault, there's no going back. We're looking at potential full-scale war. Matthew's jaw set firmly. Madam President, with all due respect, they fired the first shot when they demanded our submission and blocked our departure. War began the moment they decided humanity needed to be contained. 3 days later, Matthew's prediction proved correct. The Oryx fleet, operating under Council orders, launched an assault on Sigma Erodani. But instead of finding a vulnerable colony ripe for conquest, they encountered the Revenant and 7 Terran warships waiting in strategic positions around the planet. Oryx fleet detected, Captain, Lieutenant Vaughn reported. 12 vessels, combat formation, weapons hot. Matthew studied the tactical display. They're expecting an easy victory. Let's disappoint them. Commander Briggs, initiate Operation Counterpoint. The Terran fleet held their positions, allowing the Oryx ships to commit to their attack vector. When the invaders were fully engaged, the Revenant and 3 other ships emerged from the shadow of Sigma Eridani's moon, catching the Oryx fleet in a devastating crossfire. Target their command vessel, Matthew ordered. Disable their communications first, then weapons. The battle was brief but intense. Caught between 2 forces, the Oryx ships attempted to regroup, but the Terran vessels pressed their advantage. Precision strikes crippled the Oryx flagship, and without central coordination, their formation fell apart. "They're retreating, sir," Vaughn announced as the surviving Oryx ships limped toward the jump point. Matthew watched them go, his expression somber despite the victory. "Casualties?" 2 dead, 17 wounded across the fleet, Briggs reported. "The Intrepid took heavy damage but is stable." Matthew nodded slowly. "Have all ships stand down to yellow alert, and send a message to Earth. Tell them Sigma Eridani is secure." But this was just the beginning. The news of the Oryx defeat sent shockwaves through this council. An emergency session was convened on Veros Prime, but unity had already begun to fracture. The chambers that had once housed confident deliberations now echoed with accusation and blame. "This is your failure, Drellis!" Warlord Korak bellowed, his scaled face flushed with rage. "Your diplomatic approach gave the humans time to prepare." Councillor Drellis remained outwardly calm, though her silver skin had dulled with stress. "And your solution would have been what, Korak? To exterminate them immediately? That would only confirm their accusations that we seek to dominate, rather than cooperate." Syndic Vera leaned forward. "Cooperation is not the issue. The humans must be taught their place. I propose a full blockade of all Terran colonies. Starve them into submission." Teknar, ever the pragmatist, shook his elongated head. "A blockade requires ships we no longer have to spare. The Oryx fleet was one of our strongest tactical units, and they were outmaneuvered by a fraction of the human forces." The debate raged for hours, but no consensus was reached. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, public opinion continued to shift. Worlds that had once been neutral began to reconsider their positions. The image of a younger species standing up to the Council's authority resonated with many who had suffered similar treatment. On Ardentia, a trading hub world with significant political influence, public demonstrations in support of Earth began to appear. The Council's representatives there reported growing unrest and anti-Council sentiment spreading like wildfire. Matthew received the intelligence reports with cautious optimism. "Commodore Hale," he addressed his strategic advisor, "what do you make of these developments?" The Commodore, a veteran of numerous conflicts, studied the data carefully. "The Council is fracturing, sir. They've relied on the appearance of unity and invincibility for centuries. Earth's defiance has created cracks in that facade." Intelligence Officer Keller nodded in agreement. "We're also seeing increased communication between previously neutral worlds. There's talk of a coalition forming, not necessarily pro-Earth, but definitely anti-Council." Matthew considered this information. "Then our next move should be decisive enough to widen those cracks, but measured enough not to alienate potential allies." The opportunity came sooner than expected. Intelligence revealed that the Council was gathering a significant force at Epsilon Gate, a crucial hyperspace junction that controlled access to multiple sectors, including several key Terran supply routes. "They're preparing for a major offensive," Matthew explained to President Langley during their secure briefing. 27 ships, including a Virari cruiser named Zarathal, 2 Oryx carriers, 4 Junoan frigates, and numerous support vessels. "And your assessment?" the President asked. "A perfect target," Matthew replied confidently. If we can defeat them decisively at Epsilon Gate, we not only protect our supply lines, but demonstrate to the galaxy that the Council's military supremacy is a myth. The President's expression remained grave. The casualties could be significant, Captain. Yes, ma'am. But the cost of inaction would be higher. If they secure Epsilon Gate, they can strangle our outer colonies one by one. After a moment's consideration, President Langley nodded. Proceed, Captain Rains. But remember, we're fighting for independence, not conquest. Keep civilian casualties to an absolute minimum. The plan Matthew developed was ambitious. The Revenant would lead a fleet of 30 Terran ships, supplemented by 10 Solarian vessels that had declared their support for Earth following the Sigma Eridani victory. While outnumbering the Council forces, many of the Allied ships were smaller and less heavily armed. Their advantage would have to come from superior tactics. The key is the Zarathal, Matthew explained to his commanders during the pre-battle briefing. Virari ships rely on a centralized command structure. Their shields are nearly impenetrable from the front, but vulnerable when power is diverted to weapon systems. Commander Briggs nodded in understanding. So we force them to fire, then strike at the weak points. Exactly. Once the Zarathal is disabled, the rest of their fleet will lose cohesion. That's when we press our advantage. The two fleets met at Epsilon Gate in what would later be known as the turning point of the conflict. The Council forces had arranged themselves in a classic defensive formation, with the Zarathal at its center, protected by layers of support ships. They're waiting for us to make the first move, Lieutenant Vaughn observed, as the Terran fleet maintained position just outside weapons range. Matthew smiled grimly. Then let's not disappoint them. Execute Maneuver Theta. The Terran fleet suddenly split into 3 distinct groups. The smallest, led by a trio of fast attack craft, surged forward, as if attempting to flank the Council formation. Predictably, the Zarathal redirected power to its forward weapons array and opened fire. Now, Matthew ordered. The main Terran force, including the Revenant, accelerated directly toward the Zarathal's exposed flank. Simultaneously, the Solarian ships emerged from behind a nearby asteroid field, creating a 3-pronged attack that forced the Council fleet to divide its attention. Zarathal is redirecting shield power, Vaughn reported excitedly. Vulnerability detected in sectors 7 through 12. All ships, concentrate fire on those sectors, Matthew commanded. Don't let them rebalance their shields. The space around Epsilon Gate erupted in weapons fire. The Revenant shuddered as it took multiple hits, but its shields held. Meanwhile, the concentrated barrage against the Zarathal's exposed sections began to show results. Explosions bloomed across the Virari cruiser's hull as critical systems failed. They're losing power to their main engines, Briggs reported. Shield integrity down to 30%. Matthew leaned forward in his command chair. Press the advantage. All ships, maintain fire on the Zarathal. Don't let them recover. The Virari vessel attempted to retreat behind its escorts, but the damage was too severe. With a final devastating salvo from the Revenant, the Zarathal's main power core destabilized, sending cascading explosions throughout the ship. Zarathal is going dark, Vaughn announced. Their command network is collapsing. Just as Matthew had predicted, the loss of the command ship threw the Council fleet into disarray. Without the Zarathal's coordination, their carefully planned defense crumbled. The Oryx carriers attempted to launch their fighter craft, but the Solarian ships intercepted them with ruthless efficiency. They're breaking formation, Briggs observed. Beginning to retreat. Matthew nodded. Let them go. We've achieved our objective. Secure Epsilon Gate. As the surviving Council ships fled in disorder, the magnitude of the victory became clear. The once invincible Galaxy Council had suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of a species they had attempted to subjugate. The psychological impact reverberated far beyond the battlefield. In the days that followed, Matthew shifted from defense to offense. The Terran fleet, now bolstered by additional allies, launched a series of rapid strikes against key Council logistics bases. Operation Iron Hammer, as it was called, targeted supply depots and communication hubs rather than civilian populations. The Tarkin outpost at Delta Leonis fell within hours, its defenses overwhelmed by precision strikes. The supply depot at Corrin's Reach, a critical refueling station for Council fleets, was captured intact. The Oryx base at Gamma Triangula, which had been preparing for another assault on Terran colonies, was neutralized before it could deploy. Each victory further eroded the Council's authority and encouraged more neutral worlds to align with Earth. But the most significant shift came when Ardentia, a major trading hub with substantial political influence, formally announced its alliance with Earth. "This is more than a military alliance," Ambassador Hall explained to Matthew during a secure communication. "It's a political earthquake. Ardentia has been neutral for centuries. Their decision to stand with us legitimizes our cause in the eyes of countless worlds." Matthew understood the implications immediately. The Council will have to respond. They can't allow a world of Ardentia's stature to defect without consequences. His prediction proved accurate. Within days, the Council had assembled its largest fleet yet, over 200 vessels drawn from all member species, with the explicit purpose of reclaiming Ardentia and crushing the growing rebellion. "They're desperate," Commodore Hale assessed. "Committing this many resources to a single operation leaves their core worlds vulnerable." Matthew studied the intelligence reports. "They're expecting us to retreat, to preserve our forces, rather than face such overwhelming numbers." "Will we?" Commander Briggs asked. Matthew's expression hardened. "No. We'll defend Ardentia with everything we have. The Council needs to learn that numerical superiority doesn't guarantee victory." The Terran fleet, along with their Ardentian and Solarian allies, comprised just over 100 ships, 74 Solarian vessels, 25 Ardentian cruisers, and 8 volunteer craft from various systems. On paper, they were heavily outmatched. But Matthew had developed a strategy that exploited the Council's greatest weakness: their rigid command structure. "The Council fleet will be led by another Virari flagship," he explained during the War Council on Ardentia, "likely larger than the Zerathal, with enhanced defenses against the tactics we used at Epsilon Gate." "Then, how do we defeat them?" asked the Ardentian fleet commander, a veteran of numerous border skirmishes. Matthew displayed a tactical simulation. "By appearing to repeat our previous strategy, then subverting it. They'll expect us to target their command ship's shield vulnerabilities again. Instead, we'll use that expectation to draw them into a trap." The battle for Ardentia began 3 days later. The Council fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, an intimidating wall of military might that stretched across the view screens of the Allied defenders. "They're hailing us," Lieutenant Vaughn reported. "On screen," Matthew ordered. A Virari admiral appeared, his silver face etched with contempt. "Captain Rains, this display of defiance has gone far enough. Surrender Ardentia and withdraw your forces, or face annihilation." Matthew's response was calm but firm. "Admiral, Ardentia has made its choice. The age of Council domination is over. We suggest you reconsider your position before more lives are lost needlessly." The Admiral's expression hardened. "So be it." The Council fleet advanced in textbook formation. Their flagship, a massive Virari dreadnought named the Sovereign, protected at its center. Just as Matthew had anticipated, they had strengthened their shield configurations based on the lessons of Epsilon Gate. "They're expecting us to attack their flanks," Briggs observed. "They've reinforced accordingly." Matthew nodded. "Which leaves their central formation vulnerable to our actual strategy. All ships, initiate Operation Sundering." The Allied fleet suddenly split into dozens of smaller tactical units, each targeting different sections of the Council formation. Rather than concentrating fire on the Sovereign, they focused on disrupting the supporting vessels that protected it. "They're trying to regroup," Vaughn reported, as the Council fleet struggled to adapt to the unexpected strategy. "Now for Phase 2, Matthew ordered. "Solarian Stealth Group, execute your run." 12 Solarian vessels, equipped with advanced cloaking technology, had positioned themselves behind the Council fleet during the initial confusion. Now, they decloaked directly in the Sovereign's blind spot and launched a devastating barrage against its engines and communication array. The massive Virari flagship lurched in space as multiple systems failed simultaneously. Cut off from its support fleet and unable to coordinate effectively, the Sovereign became a wounded giant, still dangerous, but increasingly isolated. "Their formation is breaking down," Briggs reported with barely contained excitement. "Ships are acting independently, without coordination." Matthew leaned forward. "All ships converge on the Sovereign, and this." The Allied fleet executed a brilliant convergence maneuver, concentrating overwhelming firepower on the crippled flagship. Despite its formidable defenses, the Sovereign couldn't withstand such a concentrated assault. Explosions cascaded along its massive hull as critical systems failed in chain reaction. "The Sovereign's core is going critical," Vaughn announced. "They're abandoning ship." Matthew watched as escape pods jettisoned from the dying vessel. "Ensure those pods reach safety. We're not here to massacre survivors." With the destruction of the Sovereign, the Council fleet's cohesion collapsed entirely. Individual ships began retreating in disorder, some jumping immediately to hyperspace, others forming small groups for mutual protection as they withdrew. The Battle of Ardentia became the decisive engagement of the conflict. Not only had the Allied forces defeated the largest fleet the Council had ever assembled, but they had done so while inflicting minimal civilian casualties and demonstrating mercy toward defeated enemies. The contrast between their conduct and the Council's heavy-handed approach was not lost on watching worlds. In the aftermath, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Dozens of previously neutral systems declared support for what was now being called the Terran Alliance. Council authority crumbled as member worlds began questioning centuries of policy and demanding reforms. Matthew knew that the final confrontation would have to take place at Veros Prime itself, the seat of Council power and the symbol of its authority. Intelligence reports indicated that the Council had recalled its remaining ships to defend the capital, a last desperate attempt to preserve their status. 23 vessels remain in defensive formation around Veros Prime, Intelligence Officer Keller reported. Mostly older models, staffed with inexperienced crews. They know they can't win a direct engagement. Matthew nodded grimly. "Then we offer them an alternative. One last chance to end this without further bloodshed." The Terran fleet, now augmented by ships from dozens of Allied worlds, arrived at Veros Prime 2 weeks after the Battle of Ardentia. They formed a containment perimeter around the planet, weapons powered, but not yet targeting the defensive fleet. "We're being hailed," Vaughn reported. "It's Counselor Drellis." Matthew straightened in his command chair. On screen, Drellis appeared, her once proud demeanor replaced by exhaustion and resignation. "Captain Rains, it seems our positions have been reversed since our last meeting." "Indeed, Counselor. I trust you're prepared to discuss terms." Drellis nodded slowly. "I request 1 hour to consult with the remaining Council members before we proceed." Matthew studied her expression, searching for any sign of deception. 1 hour, Counselor, not a minute more." As the communication ended, Briggs approached Matthew's chair. "Sir, do you think this is a delaying tactic?" "Possibly," Matthew conceded. "But it changes nothing. Use this hour to ensure all ships are at full combat readiness. If they choose resistance, I want this to be swift and decisive." The hour passed with tense anticipation. Throughout the fleet, crews prepared for what could be the final battle of the conflict. On the Revenant's bridge, Matthew stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the view screen showing Veros Prime, a beautiful world that had housed an increasingly corrupt institution. "The hour is up, sir," Vaughn reported. "Counselor Drellis is hailing us again." On screen, Drellis appeared, flanked by the remaining council members. Their expressions varied from resignation to barely suppressed fury. "Captain Rains, the Galaxy Council has reached its decision. We are prepared to surrender unconditionally." A murmur of surprise rippled through the Revenant's bridge. Matthew kept his expression neutral. "I'm pleased to hear it, Counselor. The terms are as follows: the immediate dissolution of the Galaxy Council in its current form, recognition of Earth's sovereignty and that of all former Council worlds, and the return of independence to all subjugated systems." Drellis nodded slowly. "We accept these terms. A formal signing ceremony can be arranged at your convenience." "Not on Veros Prime," Matthew replied firmly. "Ardentia will host the signing of the new Galactic Charter, a neutral ground for a new beginning." 2 weeks later, representatives from dozens of worlds gathered on Ardentia to witness the formal end of the Galaxy Council and the establishment of a new interstellar order. The new Galactic Charter established principles of sovereignty, mutual defense, and cooperative development without the hierarchical structure that had defined the previous regime. As the primary architect of the military campaign that had made this moment possible, Matthew was given the honor of addressing the assembly. Today marks not the triumph of one species over others, but the victory of freedom over domination, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber. Earth did not fight this conflict to replace one empire with another, but to ensure that all worlds, regardless of their age, technology, or military might, have the right to determine their own destiny. The applause that followed was thunderous, representatives from hundreds of worlds rising in unison to acknowledge the dawn of a new era in galactic relations. Hours later, after the ceremonies had concluded, Matthew stood alone in his quarters aboard the Revenant, looking out at the stars beyond Ardentia. The documents formally establishing the new galactic order lay on his desk, bearing the signatures of former enemies and new allies alike. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. Victory had been achieved, but the true challenge lay ahead, building a lasting peace from the ashes of conflict, ensuring that the sacrifices made would not be in vain. A soft chime announced an incoming communication. "Captain," Lieutenant Vaughn's voice came through the speaker. "We're receiving reports of increased pirate activity in the Outer Rim. Several former Council loyalists appear to be regrouping under a warlord banner." Matthew sighed, turning away from the viewport. The celebration had been brief indeed. "Alert Command. Have the Intrepid and Horizon ready to deploy within 6 hours. We'll address this situation before it escalates." As he reviewed the preliminary reports, Matthew reflected on the cyclical nature of conflict and peace. The Council had fallen, but new threats would inevitably rise to take its place. The galaxy was vast, filled with both opportunity and danger. But for the first time in centuries, the peoples of countless worlds faced those challenges as equals, not as masters and servants. That transformation alone made every hardship worthwhile. Matthew glanced once more at the stars beyond his viewport, no longer distant points of light representing unknown territories, but beacons of possibility in a newly liberated galaxy. Whatever challenges lay ahead, humanity and its allies would face them together. Guided by principles of freedom and mutual respect rather than domination and fear, the age of the Galaxy Council had ended. The era of true cooperation had begun. The obsidian table of the council chamber had reflected the cold light of authority. Now, the warm glow of thousands of worlds working together would illuminate the path forward. It would not be an easy journey, but it would be one worth taking. Captain Matthew Rains returned to his desk, set aside the ceremonial documents, and began preparing for the next mission. Peace, like freedom, required constant vigilance and dedication to maintain. The war might be over, but the work of building a better galaxy had only just begun.